Hey, what's up everyone? Today we're going to be doing a complete overview of how to swap an engine into your BMW. This is going to be a really basic overview if you've never done it before. So let's go ahead and get right into the video. So starting off here, to give you some backstory, I've had this wagon, this 528i, in my possession for almost 6 years now. And originally I was going to do my M5 swap into this chassis, but then I decided against it for a lot of reasons. I guess the biggest one being that this is a 6-cylinder chassis, so it's a lot easier to keep a 6-cylinder in it than it is to do a ton of modifications to make it accept the V8 power plants. So I went and bought a 540i separately and did my M5 swap in that car. You can check out those videos on my channel. But in this car, it was just housing parts and a bad motor. So we're going to be swapping in the M54 and the 5-speed transmission from my 525i parts car. This is a facelift car, although we'll just have to make small modifications to the wiring and how the engine runs to make it fit in my pre-facelift wagon. But it should be a very basic, straightforward swap, especially since we're taking the motor from one car and putting it into the same exact frame car, the same chassis. Now, if you're going to take something like this M54 and put it into a car that hasn't had an M54 before, you will have to take a lot more parts from your donor vehicle, like the throttle, which is electric, and some minor switches, modules, and things like that. You're going to want to make sure that you get all those things from the donor car before you start your swap. So now let's go ahead and take a look at some of the things we'll have to disconnect around the engine in order to get that engine assembly removed from the car. First things first, we're going to start at the front of the engine where the fan is, the radiator, and we're going to start disconnecting things like the power steering lines and the AC condenser lines, because we're going to remove the front end of the car entirely. Make sure though, when you remove the AC lines like I'm doing here, that you have already evacuated the system of all that Freon in there, because it's a hefty fine if you don't, and you want to make sure that you're not polluting the environment. Also, we're going to remove the air box that's kind of in the way up here, because I want you guys to see the power steering lines. Also, if your car is an automatic, you're going to have to remove the automatic transmission lines that go to the cooler at the front of the car. Here I'm pulling out the condenser and the power steering cooler. And then also pulling out the headlights, because like I said, we're going to remove the bumper as well as the front radiator support. The entire front end of this car is going to come off, and that way we're going to be able to pull this engine down and out of the car instead of using like a traditional cherry picker or a crane or something like that. The front end of the most BMWs is held on by just a few bolts, and it's made to be removed from the car, just like I'm doing here. So if you're like me and you don't have, some of these bigger shop tools like an engine lift, then you're probably going to want to do the strategy that I'm using here, which is dropping the motor while it's still on the subframe. Also, underneath some of these covers, we have the electronics box. This has our DME, but what's important is that we can actually disconnect all the connectors from the DME here and lay them on top of the motor, and that way we don't have to mess with the wiring harness of the motor. It'll actually just stay on the motor itself. There is one connector that goes to the DME that routes into the chassis. That's the one that we might have to make some modifications for in order to have the car communicate with the new engine perfectly, because like I said, these being a pre-LCI and an LCI swap, there's going to be some differences between how the instrument cluster reads. My car didn't previously have throttle by wire, so I had to add that in, and some other things as well. Don't forget your ground strap. That's really important, especially when you're reinstalling it, because you might have some weird electrical issues if you forget to install a ground strap on your motor. Here I'm just working my way around the motor. I've got a couple more vacuum lines here. One goes to the fuel pressure regulator, which is on the chassis, and that needs to be disconnected. Also, you have these brake lines up here, like the one for the booster. It's a vacuum hose. And then finally, we have the heater core lines, which go into the firewall. Those are really easy to see, and they need to be removed from the firewall. Otherwise, you could end up stretching or breaking them. With the air intake out of the way, you can see the lower part of the steering shaft. This is really hard to capture on camera, but you want to make sure that you disconnect your steering shaft from your steering rack, and so that way the steering rack, being a part of the subframe, can separate from the car and the steering shaft will stay up with the chassis. Also down here, we've got the power cable for the starter that basically routes power from the back of the car to the front of the car. And then we can also remove the slave cylinder line, which is attached again to the firewall. We want to remove it off of the transmission. Now here I'm removing the old rusty bolts from the exhaust system because we want to remove the exhaust to get better access to the drive shaft, and also the exhaust has to be separated from the engine because, like I said, we're going to pull that engine out of the car. Here I'm just rolling the exhaust out of the way. You can see this thing is really big and heavy, and we're gonna actually reuse this on my wagon because, again, since it's the same chassis, it's really easy. All the parts are gonna transfer over from sedan to the wagon. Here I'm removing the drive shaft. This connects the rear differential to the front of the car, the transmission. This has to get removed in order for us to remove the engine. And also, you've got up here the shift linkage. This is a little bit tricky. There's a bushing that needs to be removed, and then you've got like a weather seal that has to be pulled down as well. The shift knob is up top. Go ahead and pull that out of the way. And then once you got all these things disconnected from the chassis of the car, it should just stay with the transmission. Although you want to make sure that it clears, because that shifter arm is going to be taller than the transmission. You're not just going to be able to pull it straight forward without going down first. Now here I'm removing the wheels. I wish I could have done this more gently, but they were pretty seized on, so I had to use a dead blow hammer on the back of them in order to loosen them from the hub. Finally they came off and no damage. But with those wheels removed, we have better access to the brake lines and also the connectors for the ABS sensors and the brake pad sensors. They're all up here underneath the wheel well. You're going to remove all those because those are a part of the suspension, and the suspension is going to come down with the subframe. And finally, you can see I'm putting my jack underneath the rear transmission. We're going to start working this motor down slowly with the transmission. And since this is a manual, I'm not going to use any sort of jack stand on the back of the motor and transmission assembly because it's really not that heavy. It's a very small transmission. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm just going to balance the whole subframe assembly with the motor and the suspension on it on my jack. And there's a jack point from BMW which is located in the center of the subframe. You can see it here, and that is what we're going to balance the motor off of. It's going to be a little bit tricky, but I'll show you guys how we get it down. I'm starting off by removing the subframe bolts. I think these ones are like 18 or 19 millimeters. They're usually really big on BMWs, and there's 6 of them on this car. There might be 8 on another car, maybe 4 in some cases, like on the E36. So with that last bolt removed, you can see the frame of the car actually moves up a little bit. That's because the frame is no longer supporting the weight of that motor. So it rises up a little bit, and we can start to slowly work the motor down. Now we're going to use Harbor Freight dollies in order to roll the assembly around. So you're going to see that I'm slowly dropping the motor onto those dollies. And I'd recommend having 3 of them, 2 in the front that support the suspension and the subframe, and 1 in the rear for the transmission. And it's as simple as that. The motor comes down. You want to make sure you go nice and slow because it is pretty common to have something stuck on the motor that's going to pull, yank, or stretch. But if you are careful enough, you might be able to not break anything and get that motor smoothly out of the engine bay without a problem. So So moving on, we're going to go and focus on my E39 wagon now. And like I said, the motor in here had already been previously removed, so not a lot of things are hooked up. I'm just going to quickly remove the front bumper, headlights, radiator support, and then take the wheels off. And there's, like I said, really not a lot holding this engine and transmission assembly in. So I'll just throw my jack under there, remove the subframe bolts, and there you are. We can go ahead and start removing this engine. It is a lot heavier though, so I will say if you have like a heavier engine assembly like I have here, be very careful. You know, it could go sideways really quick if you're not careful. Just make sure that you have a good balance point, that you're patient with it, and that, you know, worst comes to worst, you're out of the way in case that motor starts falling in the wrong direction. So now I'm basically going to play a game of musical chairs with these engine assemblies, moving one out of the way so I can get the new motor installed in my wagon, and then we'll take that old junky V8 and put it in our parts car, which will eventually get recycled. And while we have the motors still in the correct place but not installed in the engine bay, we're going to look over and make sure there's nothing else that we need to remove. Such things like, in my case, I had to get the AC lines off of my parts car because I didn't have any on my car. Also, things like the heat shield, some of the plastic trim pieces, you know, brake lines, things that we have to transfer over into my E39 to get it running. And not all these things would be necessary as part of the swap, but because my car was a work in progress for a very long time and a parts car for a very long time, I need to install some things. Now, getting the V8 motor into my parts car was definitely a pain in the butt because it is so heavy, and that automatic transmission is also big as well. So went and installed that, and eventually I was able to get the subframe assembly aligned enough to get the bolts installed, but it can be really tricky, and I would just, again, recommend that you take your time. You don't want this engine assembly to fall. You do want to use some jack stands as you bring it up, lift up the front, put it on jack stands, lift up the rear with the transmission, put that on jack stands. And just the same thing is going to go for my M54 motor as well. Although it is much lighter, so it is much easier for me to muscle it into place. And don't forget as well the suspension. You need to get those struts into the wheel wells so that they can bolt up to where they're supposed to be. Now with all that done, you can take a look underneath the car and confirm that the engine is fully installed. It looks absolutely great inside of the engine bay. The only thing left is to install the rear transmission cross member, which bolts right into place. And then we can start assembling the front end of the vehicle, including the radiator support and the bumper, the headlights. Same thing on our parts car as well. We want to get that thing assembled and try to sell it for some good money, end up recycling it. And that's basically as far as it goes mechanically for this swap. You'll want to reconnect everything that I showed you in the first half of the video, the steering shaft, all the coolant and fluid lines, everything that we removed from the parts car, we're going to have to reconnect in my wagon. And the only other thing that's going to present a lot of challenge in this swap is actually the DME and the wiring. So since the M54 uses a DME, an engine computer, which has a security system on it connected to the key, and we're now going to be using a new key and a new key module in our wagon, we need to do what's known as an EWS delete on our DME. Originally, I bought a parts DME and I was going to install that, but it ended up not working. So what I did was I took my DME and I sent that out to someone who was able to remove the EWS component on the software and then send it back to me. So it's the exact same DME, all the same tuning characteristics and coding that it had before, it will have now. So it still thinks that it's a manual 525i sedan. And to let you guys know, some of the wiring changes that we had to make were the DMTL pump was on the wrong pin. Same thing with the, I believe, secondary air pump system trigger. Just some things that are, I guess, not super important. They would be plug and play. You might not notice them if you installed the DME initially. You might be able to get the car started. But one of the things that was important was wiring in this positive contact for the engine wire harness. So what I did was I cut off the connector from the old parts car and I was able to solder it onto my car, so it had kind of like an OEM finish to it, and it can still be disconnected in the future if you're going to be removing the engine for any reason. So that's a look at what it takes to do an engine swap in a BMW, and same thing for a lot of cars. I didn't go into a lot of detail step by step on things because of course that would be a very different video. It'd be a lot longer and it'd be a lot more specific to doing it on this motor and this chassis. I tried to stay a little bit more high level for you guys to just show you some techniques, some things to check off your list, and how to remove a motor when you don't have like an engine crane or something like that. So if you guys enjoyed this video, please let me know with a like or a comment down below. Subscribe to the channel as well, and we will see you in the next one.